Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos on this channel, mainly surrounding true crime and psychological cases, as well as a little bit of fashion and lifestyle sprinkled in where I can. Now today I'm finally back with a new true crime video. I feel like I've been saying that a lot. As you can tell, I've actually been quite ill. I literally came back from holiday where I've been so prepared with uploading. I got loads of videos up for you guys, all regular and everything, and then the second I came back from holiday and I needed to film some more videos, I got really ill and lost my voice, and I only just started gaining it back, so today isn't too bad. I just sound a little bit nasally, but I hope you guys can put up with it for today. So today's true crime case is one that I have definitely been absolutely fascinated with for as long as I can remember actually. It's just one of those cases that I've always wanted to do and I've always kind of researched, and it's always kind of stuck with me, but I've never actually sat down and done it for you, so I'm really glad to be bringing it to you today because it's definitely a fascinating case. It's actually a solved case, which I know you guys, a lot of you guys actually like to hear about because you like hearing some of these cases that actually have answers, and this one was a very pivotal case for its kind, for well, stalking, as you will find out. It changed a lot of things in terms of laws, so I'll go into a little bit about that at a later point in the video. So today we're going to be discussing the case of Rebecca Schaeffer, and like I said, it's a fascinating case, and I think this video is actually going to be quite a long one because I have listened to you guys are always asking me for longer videos, and I have kind of been trying to change the way that I talk about things. I've always been quite brief in the past, not brief, I've kind of always been very matter of fact and just kind of stated the facts because that is how I am naturally as a person. I don't usually like kind of explain things in too much detail, which I'm changing because so many of you guys wanted me to do kind of longer videos, so I'm hoping that today is the day that I kick that off because I have a lot of information here. So I hope you guys are ready. As always, I like to add a very quick disclaimer at the start of my videos, just to say that I'm not an expert. I'm not claiming to be an expert in any of the cases that I film. I am literally only piecing together the research that I can find myself online, so I am only able to gain access to whatever's on the internet. So because of that fact, I apologise if I get anything wrong, if I miss anything out, if I mispronounce anything. I'm not trying to do anyone any harm or an injustice, and of course all of you guys are more than welcome to correct me down below if I do get anything wrong. So without further ado, we shall just get on to discussing the case of Rebecca Schaeffer. So if you'd like to hear a little bit about the case, then keep on watching and we shall just get started. So I apologise if at any point anything changes. The lighting is going crazy outside, so the camera setting might go a bit funny at points. I'll try and stop it if I can. And also I am in a weird setting. I'm not used to the setting. I've come home to stay with my mum in Colchester for a few days, so that's why things are kind of might be a little bit weird, so I apologise about that. Rebecca Lucille Schaeffer was born on November the 6th, 1967 in a place called Eugene in Oregon in the US. She was the only child to a couple named Dana and Benson Schaeffer, with her mum actually having a doctorate in child psychology. And she was raised in a very Jewish household, so she was raised to be very religious. She attended a high school called Lincoln High, and from a very young age she actually decided that because of her very strong Jewish upbringing, she decided that she wanted to train to become a rabbi. However, this did change when she was 16 and into her junior year of high school, when she actually started modelling work. It was a local hairdresser who she went to visit for an appointment who referred her to a modelling agency that she knew because of how beautiful and how gorgeous, naturally stunning Rebecca was. She said outright to Rebecca how she thought she would do amazing in the modelling industry because Rebecca was naturally gorgeous. She was such an innocent beauty, if that makes sense. She had this gorgeous, thick, full head of curls. She was so sweet looking and so innocent, and so this hairdresser sent her contact details to a friend of hers who actually owned a modelling agency. And Rebecca's girl next door natural beauty worked out really well for her when this modelling agency offered to take her on as one of their models, and surely enough Rebecca jumped at the chance. During her school life she began her modelling career appearing in catalogues. She did some shoots for magazines and even appeared as extras in some films. So she began off doing little odd jobs, but she seemed to not struggle to get work whatsoever, as she was so naturally gorgeous that this girl next door look just seemed to be really all the rage. Rebecca was absolutely loving her new career choice, and she seemed like such a natural fit. She'd kept up with her schoolwork, she'd made such a positive impression with everyone that she'd worked with that she didn't seem like a young kind of starlet in a way. She wasn't really big-headed. She seemed so down to earth and uplifting to everyone that she came into contact with, and she just seemed genuinely happy with this new path of hers. And in the year 1984, her modelling career looks as though it really has the potential to take off. However, she comes to realise that she would most likely need to move out of Oregon if she really wanted to take her career to the next level. She needed to go somewhere where there was a lot more opportunities for people trying to break into the modelling industry, where there were more jobs, where it was kind of more of a focus. And in the 80s, where else was more fitting than New York City? And in the summer of 1984, her parents actually agreed to let her move to New York City temporarily by herself, almost like a trial period, to see how she would deal kind of providing for herself, making a living, and also trying to build this modelling career for herself through her modelling agency. She was working with a management team called Elite Model Management, who were also working with a number of other young aspiring models all around sort of Rebecca's same age. So Rebecca gets herself settled through these first few trial months. She essentially falls in love with the city. She seems like such a perfect fit for it. She falls in love with everything, the whole living, everything, the environment. And her parents do come to realise this. And so by the end of summer, they all come to agree that if it's what she wanted, she could move to live in New York City permanently. And this obviously would not have been an easy decision for her parents to make whatsoever, considering the fact that she was only 16 years old at the time, and New York was all the way over the other side of the country. But ultimately, they were aware of just how passionate and talented their daughter was, and so it just seemed like the right move. It's worth noting that Rebecca, despite only being 16 years old, definitely didn't act like it. She was a very, very mature young woman for her age. She was very, very aware of herself. She could handle a lot of things, and she managed to prove that to her parents and all of her loved ones and all of her peers in those first few trial months while living in New York by herself. And this was an extremely useful quality to have while attempting to break into the entertainment industry at such a young age, because there were so many people attempting to do the same thing that it's obviously an extremely difficult industry to break into, and it's considered virtually impossible for you to enter the industry unless you start at such a young age. So for a young girl, around the perfect sort of age for her to attempt to make this big break, to be so mature and self-aware and carry herself so well, it just seemed like she was born for this. So when it was decided that Rebecca would move to New York City permanently, she decided to move into a relatively small New York apartment with a group of other young aspiring models that she knew. Being New York City, it was only a small 2-bedroom apartment, and there was actually about 6 other girls living there. But this was what Rebecca and they all wanted. They all knew that it was an extremely tough thing that they had ahead of them, a really, really difficult journey breaking into this really, really overly saturated industry, and they all knew that they would do whatever it took to make it. Rebecca decides to keep up her education by attending a professional children's school in New York, which was attempting to provide a traditional and real-life application education to kids who were actively attempting to enter the entertainment industry in any form. And everyone who knew her in New York made it clear that she seemed so fit for the city. She could handle everything, and she seemed so comfortable living there. And it seemed like nothing could overwhelm her or frighten her, despite it potentially being a very overwhelming and frightening experience. And there's a story about on one of her first nights actually staying in New York permanently, she was actually nearly attacked by a stranger on a street where she was alone, but she simply turned around to her attacker, punched him straight in the face, and walked off like it was nothing, like it could not faze her whatsoever, which is obviously a very incredible stance for a 16-year-old in New York alone to take. And so it just seemed like Rebecca Schaeffer was made for New York City. Now, it was while she was living in New York that she decided that she didn't want to just focus on modelling, and she wanted to expand her horizons, including acting. And this just seemed like a good idea, considering she had such a love of drama while she was in high school, that it just seemed like the right time and place to build on this and maybe attack the industry from multiple angles. She soon signs up to an acting agency in New York and very quickly finds herself in a short role as Annie Barnes in a soap called One Life to Live. And this role actually ended up being a 6-month gig, which was a very, very expressive stint for someone who had literally only just started her acting career, had no experience, only just signed onto an agency, and she was already getting her name and face out there. If you think of just how many girls would have been training for a lot longer than Rebecca from a younger age to have gained a role like this on their repertoire, and then for it to go to Rebecca, a young, unexperienced, untrained girl, it was just a very, very impressive thing for her to do. And things were going extremely well, so it seemed, for her acting career. However, her modelling career began to flop. She very quickly began to realise that her height was gradually becoming an issue with her modelling career, and it was kind of preventing her from developing any further into this career. She was actually only about 5'7", which obviously is not considered short by any means. However, for the fashion industry, it definitely wasn't quite meeting the average height requirements. And so she wasn't quite meeting the kind of minimum requirements to book a lot of shoots. And so she began to really struggle on that front. I'm not entirely sure how things are nowadays in the modelling industry. I don't think they're as bad. I think there is a little bit more diversity in parts that are being gradually introduced into some areas within the fashion industry. However, at the time, high fashion and supermodels and catwalk models were typically very, very tall. And she'd also begun to realise that this naturally pretty, innocent, girl next door look that she had going on, that did her well when she began her modelling career in Oregon, wasn't really cutting it in New York. Like I said, it was the hub of high fashion, of couture. And all in all, these modelling agencies weren't really looking for this type of thing. They were looking for the typical high fashion standard. And it was mainly her height and her youthful look that was preventing Rebecca from really tapping into this high fashion look of New York. And then when Rebecca was just 17 years old, she made the huge lifestyle choice to move to Tokyo in Japan. She had hoped that this would be a huge career boosting move, as this whole girl next door thing was a lot more in demand over there. It was a lot more sought after, and there just seemed to be more work for her over there. If she wanted to continue her modelling work, this seemed like the right place for her. Sadly though, even when she was out there, she did manage to tap into this girl next door look that was really, really popular. However, her height remained an issue. And sadly, because it was such a major issue that prevented her from booking any work, she ended up moving virtually straight back to New York and decided that it was the best thing for herself and her career to focus solely on acting, because clearly the modelling thing just wasn't working out for her. And back in New York, she didn't struggle too much to gain work with acting, because she had built such a good reputation as being very hardworking, very mature on her previous work as Annie Barnes on the soap opera One Life to Live. So eventually she actually landed a role on Woody Allen's Radio Days. It had only been a minor part, so much so that she was actually playing a nameless character, and eventually in kind of post-production they ended up editing out a lot of her lines. But she did, however, remain in some parts of the film, and so she was still credited as being a member of the cast. And very soon after finishing this project, she actually landed a role, and this time it was on Steven Spielberg's TV series Amazing Stories. As much as she did manage to be relatively successful by gaining these parts on these projects, she did receive a lot of rejection, which obviously was normal when you are trying to become an actress. She received a lot of rejection, and she just constantly kind of kept going back. She never really stopped. She kept building herself, taking the criticism, trying again, constantly trying out for new roles, as she was adamant that she was going to make it. The sad reality of this lifestyle though meant that she was really struggling to support herself until she could find a decent, reliable, stable piece of work or a project to work on. And so this meant that she was struggling to pay bills, her debt was building up essentially, and she really desperately needed to find some solid work to support herself. And towards the end of 1986, she began to find it really, really difficult to support herself on what little funds she could get, and she even considered taking up another job. I believe she did a little bit of waitressing job on the side, but she was getting quite desperate and she wanted to keep trying. She tried to remain optimistic that her acting career was going to take off, but obviously it was looking extremely bleak at that time. Her phone had even been cut off at that point because she was she couldn't pay the bills. But one day she returned home to find a note on her front door from her agent, and it basically told her that she needed to get in touch urgently as there was a new Warner Brothers TV show that was in its casting stages and she would be perfect fit for it. Basically, they were adamant that she should go for it. And this TV series, My Sister Sam, would be a huge break for Rebecca, with thousands of people across the country eventually falling in love with her as the character Patty Russell, the sister to the main character. She ended up moving to Hollywood to secure this role, and this actually meant that she got to live much closer to her grandparents who already lived out there, which obviously came to a huge relief to her parents, who were very aware that she was living a very lonely lifestyle previously. She'd been living alone for so long from such a young age. They were so happy she could finally live near some of her family members. And Rebecca was able to use her youthful girl-next-door appearance to her advantage in this role as Patty, because Patty was a 16-year-old girl and she essentially became television's sweetheart with her big bouncy curls and her naturally stunning features. And the show itself was extremely successful in its first season. It was actually ranked in the top 25 TV series in terms of ratings, which was obviously extremely good for a brand new pilot season. However, its success did soon begin to wither, and eventually it was actually cancelled midway through its second season. So halfway through its second season in the year 1988, My Sister Sam was cancelled, meaning that Rebecca was once again looking for work. However, this show did manage to put her on the map. She was a much more recognised name and face now. She had, like I said, had so many people falling in love with her. She did such good work on the show, and it was so successful that she really didn't struggle at this point to gain attention. She began landing cover shoots for magazines, she was doing loads of interviews, and she had loads of potential roles that she was put up for and auditioning for. And her next huge role following My Sister Sam, like I'm talking life-changing role, was looking to be a part on Godfather Part 3, which obviously would be a huge break for her, and this would have boosted her career even further. And this is when we fast forward to the year of 1989, when Rebecca lands the role in The Godfather Part 3, and she is waiting to prepare herself for her next career boosting role in this brand new huge film. She's waiting at home for the delivery of her script so she could prepare for her new role when she hears her doorbell ring, and she is faced with a man named Robert Bardo. Robert John Bardo was born on the 2nd of January 1970, the youngest of 7 children in his family. His father had been an officer in the US Air Force and had met his mother, who was born and raised in Japan, just shortly before the birth of his eldest sibling. In the year 1983, when Robert was just 13 years old, the family found themselves at home in Tucson, Arizona, and they all moved here and set up a beautiful life together. However, Bardo's life was not by far an easy one, as it is noted that he had a particularly difficult and troubling childhood in his early years. From a very young age, Bardo found himself being bullied and ultimately physically and mentally abused by one of his siblings, and this actually got to the point so bad, to the point where he threatened to commit suicide if the abuse didn't stop. Because of this suicide threat, he was actually removed from his family temporarily and placed in foster care until they could ensure that he would be able to live in the family safely. And early into his teens, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and this then escalated when he was around 15 years old, to the point where his guardians were very concerned for his mental well-being. They ended up institutionalizing him in hopes of him getting professional help for what they claimed as being emotional problems, because they were just very concerned with a lot of his behaviours. Bardo never completed his 9th grade of high school, as he decided to drop out and work full-time as a janitor in a local Jack in the Box fast food restaurant. And fast forward to Bardo's adult life between the years of 1988 and 1989, the 18 months leading up to Rebecca Schaeffer's death. Bardo had been arrested a total of 3 times in those 18 months. Each of them had been on charges relating to domestic violence or disorderly conduct, and so it was generally considered by his peers and people who came across him that he was quite an unsettling and aggressive person. And the most notable thing that's said about Robert Bardo is that from a young age he would actually have developed a number of unsettlingly strong obsessions with young female celebrities. At a very young age, so he was only 13 years old when this was known, he actually became fully obsessed with a young girl named Samantha Smith. Samantha Smith was about 10 years old at the time of her becoming the subject of Robert Bardo's obsessions, and she was known as a child peace activist when she was only 10 years old, following a letter that she had written to a man named Yuri Andropov, who was the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. At the time, the United States and the Soviet Union were in the height of the Cold War, and there were a lot of threats being made about a nuclear war. People were basically very concerned about nuclear missiles being sent, and she was not alone, but this 10-year-old girl decided to write a letter to this Yuri Andropov, and she basically asked him to ease her fears that there would be a nuclear war. So the letter read, I've copied the letter here. Dear Mr. Andropov, my name is Samantha Smith. I am 10 years old. Congratulations on your new job. I have been worrying about Russia and the United States getting into a nuclear war. Are you going to vote to have a war or not? If you aren't, please tell me how you are going to help to not have a war. This question you do not have to answer, but I would like to know why you want to conquer the world, or at least our country. God made the world for us to share and to take care of, not to fight over or have one group of people own it all. Please let's do what he wanted and have everybody be happy too. Samantha Smith. Her letter was then published by a newspaper in the Soviet Union, and she ultimately received a response from Yuri Andropov himself. Samantha had touched the hearts of so many people across the Soviet Union and the United States as this pure innocence of this young girl hoping that there would be no more fighting, no more war. It just touched so many hearts, and she became a household name at only 10 years old, and not long after that she earned the title of a peace activist for her continuing on. She did so much work as she got older to earn this title even further, and she at this age, at 10 years old, was so popular that she actually piqued the interest of a 13-year-old Robert Bardo. So she became one of Bardo's first stalking victims. She was only 10 years old, like I said, he was 13. He sent her relentless, he sent her so many letters, prompting a response. I don't know if she ever received any, but he was well and truly obsessed with her. And then came Rebecca Schaeffer, his next victim. His obsession began upon his first viewing of My Sister Sam, when his interest became piqued by Patty, the younger sister of the main character, who was played by Rebecca. He fell in love with the youthful, sweet appearance of Patty, or Rebecca, and this was just the start. So as a consequence of his obsession being with Patty, obviously Rebecca was his next target. He'd write her letters constantly, and he even made multiple attempts to visit her on the Warner Brothers lot where they would shoot My Sister Sam. Obviously he was turned away, but he would turn up with gifts, flowers, chocolates, everything imaginable, but obviously the security would never let him through the gates, so she was never really alerted of his existence, really. At one point, one of his letters actually received a response from Rebecca. So as I'm sure you guys are aware, a lot of celebrities, when they receive a lot of fan mail, they physically aren't able to respond to each one individually and personally, so they kind of have like a set of stock responses that they use. Sometimes they're pre-prepared, usually it will come with like an autograph and maybe a photo of them, and that's basically what Robert Bardo received from Rebecca Schaeffer. She sent him what I'm sure she sent a lot of other people who sent her letters that she couldn't personally respond to, so it was kind of like a stock response, kind of thank you, you know, you're appreciated, a photo potentially and an autograph. But obviously he took this as a lot more than it had intended to be, and he took this kind of as a sign that she knew of his existence and that she was aware of his love for her and she was reciprocating. So because Bardo genuinely believed that Rebecca's response was the declaration of her reciprocation for his feelings for her, he decided to take it to the next level, and he actually hired a private investigator, paid them to find out Rebecca's home address and provide him with it. Now what's concerning about this is just how easy it was for them to gain Rebecca's address and give it out to whoever paid them. It was actually a method used that members of the public could use as well. So essentially all they did was pay about $250 at the DMV, fill out a form where they basically said why they wanted the address, whose address they wanted, where it was going to be shared, and that was it. They got her address and made a profit off it. But it is just concerning how easy it would be for any member of the public to have gained anyone's address at that time. And this just goes to show how few laws there were and restrictions put in place to prevent anyone from stalking. So back to July of 1989 in Rebecca's home. Rebecca was renting a house in California when she moved by herself. She had gone from living in this tiny little New York City apartment crammed in with like 6 or 7 girls to this larger Californian home by herself, and she seemed perfectly happy. It was obviously a complete adjustment when she'd moved to California. Rebecca's friends were aware of her actually being in a full-time serious relationship after meeting through friends. So this man's name was Brad Silberling, and he would go on to be a very, very successful director in a number of film and TV works. He has actually since worked on projects including Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events in 2004, Jane the Virgin and Dynasty. And in general terms, despite My Sister Sam being cancelled so early on, Rebecca Schaeffer seemed to be doing really well for herself. She had recently featured in a film called Scenes from the Class Struggle in Beverly Hills, which was quite a jump in genre from what she was used to. It's categorised as a black comedy, which means that it caters to a slightly more dark humour than the average comedy flick, and so this was obviously very, very different to the family-friendly show that she had been previously working on. This film had been released in the year 1989, and this was obviously at the height of Bardot's fascination with Rebecca. However, at the time he had kind of eased off on his obsessions with Rebecca in particular since the cancellation of My Sister Sam. But then once he'd seen the film Scenes from a Class Struggle in Beverly Hills, he found himself once again kind of reawakening this obsession with her. However, he found himself watching this familiar face of Rebecca Schaeffer, this youthful girl next door, beautiful, naturally stunning girl, but she was playing a lot more of a different character than he was used to and that he had fallen in love with, essentially. So he had initially been attracted to the character of Patty, who was a 16-year-old. She was very young and innocent, while in this most recent film of hers, she played a character called Zandra who matched Patty in no way. At one point in the film, she even had a sex scene, and this was said to completely enrage and anger Bardot as he was watching the innocence of this girl he thought he knew and he'd fallen in love with being taken away from him in front of his very eyes. So Bardot at this point is 19 years old, and it seems as though he is being completely overridden by his emotions. He decides to mail a letter to his sister, who at that time was living in Tennessee, and to her at the point it was very, very cryptic. She didn't really know what it meant. Obviously it was quite unexplained, and this obviously at the time it just alone didn't arouse any suspicion. In the letter he had gone to mention how he had this desire for this Rebecca, and he believed that if he couldn't have her then no one else could. And he even admitted in the letter that he was obsessed with the idea of what was seen as unobtainable, as he put it. So the more that something was out of his reach, the more he wanted it. And so we continue the story on July the 18th, 1989, when Rebecca Schaeffer is sat alone in her home having kind of a chill day. She is waiting in for the delivery of her script for her part in The Godfather Part 3. All of her hard work seemed to be paying off at this point, as she was becoming a well-known name in the industry with so many more doors being opened up for her. It just seemed like a lot of good was about to come her way. Although sadly, this bright future that she seemed to have ahead of her would sadly be ripped away from her by one selfish individual. So Bardot had managed to gain Rebecca's full living address just a few days before from the private investigator that he had hired. On July the 17th, he purchased a firearm from a local gun shop. He originally had gone in there alone, filled out the application form, which required the disclosure of any previous mental illnesses to be stated, and obviously he did. He diagnosed with bipolar disorder when he was young, so because of this they flat out rejected his application. They said, you can't buy a firearm because of your history of mental illness. And so he became extremely angry. He flipped out, so much so that the person serving him had no choice but to kind of pin up his application, so his name, all of his details, up in front of the register for any other employees, basically saying like, do not serve this person under any circumstances because of the scene that he has caused, and he has a history of mental illness. But it didn't seem to stop him. He left the shop, came back with his brother, convinced his brother to fill out the form in his name, and they were handed over this handgun. It absolutely baffles me that they were able to do this so easily, because Bardo was literally stood there next to his brother while his brother was filling out the application. But obviously his brother, as much as yes, he was to blame because he purchased the firearm for him, he also couldn't have known just how unstable his brother was. He didn't know what he was going to do. He didn't know he was going to murder this young girl. It's July the 18th, 1989, and Bardo is on Rebecca's street. He is knocking around on each of her neighbours' doors, claiming to be a friend of Rebecca's and that she had given him her address. He just wanted to confirm with them that he'd gotten the right house, he was knocking on the right door, And so obviously they were all not really concerned by this, because he did already have her address. He said he was a friend, and it would seem unlikely for someone to have her address if they weren't a friend. So obviously they were all just saying like, yeah, you got the right number, that's the number over there. So before long, he is at her doorstep, and then he rings her doorbell. Rebecca initially answers the door very quickly because she was obviously waiting around for this script to be delivered. So she heard the doorbell and assumed that it was the delivery of her Godfather script. It is worth noting that typically she would be able to talk to whoever was at the front door through an intercom system like a lot of houses would have had. So usually she could find out who was at the door before going to answer it in person. However, just a few days before this, weirdly enough, her intercom system stopped working. And so on this day she had to go and answer the door herself. As you can imagine, she was quite taken aback. A bit uncomfortable by the fact that she'd opened the door to this stranger. She remains sweet and obviously lovely to him. She almost humoured him in a sense. She didn't see any harm in being nice to him. She had no reason to be nasty, so she chatted to him for a little bit and made sure that she was really nice to him. Bardo actually pulls out the letter response that she had sent to him years before, just to kind of show her almost like proof of their relationship that obviously she didn't actually know about. And he'd obviously placed great emotional significance on this letter. And Rebecca simply remained kind of brief and nice in their conversation. She didn't really know him at all. He was talking to her like it was like on a personal level, and obviously she was just being polite, almost as though she was just hoping that the conversation would come to a natural end soon. Before long, Rebecca shakes his hand, says that she hopes he has a nice day, and asks him not to return. She shuts the door on him, and that is that. But Robert Bardo has other ideas. At first he found himself in a complete daze following their conversation. He'd actually just spoken to her in person and he was shocked. He was in awe of this woman that he had obviously idolised for years, that he'd actually spoken to in such close proximity. And he ended up walking away to a nearby restaurant. He orders a portion of onion rings and then a cheesecake, sits there and eats them. And then this is when things take a turn. So at some point during his lunch by himself, he manages to convince himself that he needs to return back to Rebecca's home and confront her, because essentially he had placed such great significance on this encounter. He had it in his mind that they had this long relationship stemming back many years, that obviously all the feelings were reciprocal, and that when she'd see him in person, she would immediately fall in love with this stranger who was doing this great romantic gesture, coming all this way and declaring his love for her. So that when she didn't initially fall in love with him, he was enraged, he was furious. At a later point, while he was being examined by a professional psychologist, Bardo actually claimed that his intentions while heading back to Rebecca's home were entirely innocent, that he had actually made her a CD before the trip that he had always intended on giving to her. He just was in a complete daze when he first met her during their first conversation, that he forgot about it, and he wanted to return back to her home to give her this homemade CD that he had for her. He claims that his intentions had never been to hurt her, although the gun that he was carrying would clearly suggest otherwise. What's also interesting to note in this case is that he also was carrying on him a copy of the book The Catcher in the Rye, which has been mentioned in relation to multiple true crime cases in history, namely John Hinckley Jr., who had an obscene obsession with the actress Jodie Foster, and he'd actually attempted to assassinate President Ronald Reagan in hopes of impressing this huge Hollywood actress. And he was found with a copy of The Catcher in the Rye in his home, and it was said to be a huge inspiration of his during this attack. And in addition to this case, John Lennon's shooter, Mark David Chapman, was said to have strong ties and strong influences from the book as well. So A Catcher in the Rye has been mentioned and has acted as influence allegedly to a number of other shootings. According to some sources, Bardo actually also rang his sister very shortly before arriving at Rebecca's for the second time. The same sister who he had previously sent the letter to, who lives in Tennessee, and basically they had a very brief conversation, not enough so that she could really understand what was going on. At this point, obviously, she was completely in the dark, and I think she kind of just thought that she'd seen him do so many strange things throughout their life, because obviously he had such a long history of mental illness that it wasn't always easy to understand where he was going with things. It wasn't always understand to predict his actions. And it is likely that in her situation, no one could have guessed what was about to happen. No one thinks anyone is capable of murder until it actually happens. And so in this situation over the phone, she likely had no idea and wouldn't have been able to tell. So Bardo heads back to Rebecca's home once again and rings the doorbell. And obviously this time the doorbell goes again. She once again assumes it's the delivery that she has been waiting in eagerly for all morning. However, she opens the door and once again comes face to face with this strange man who had just declared his love for her and she had just turned away. At this point, Rebecca, as expected as any of us would be, was quite agitated by this man who was essentially, he was being an annoyance, he was wasting her time, he was on her property, he didn't know her, and he was probably starting to scare her at this point. And so she likely wasn't as calm as maybe she had been with him in their first encounter, but I mean, you can't really blame her. I know I'd probably be the same if this stranger just kept turning up at my house uninvited. So can you really blame her? In hindsight, Bardo recalled how the tone that she had used with him during this second encounter had annoyed him greatly, as she came across as bratty, as he put it. And the one thing that had stuck with him after it all happened during their second conversation was that she told him that he was wasting her time, and he clearly didn't take it well. He clearly thought that he would mean a lot more to her, so when she told him he was wasting her time, something kind of snapped in him. And this is when he pulls out the handgun that he's holding behind him and shoots her twice in the chest at point blank range. He immediately runs away from Rebecca's home, and he later says that he recalls her screaming "why" as she falls to the ground while he runs away from what just happened. And her screaming, as well as the gunshot noises, is obviously what alerted a neighbour of hers to come and find her. Rebecca's neighbour, a man called Richard Goldman, runs to the source of the noise. He runs to Rebecca's home and he finds her lying on her back in her dressing gown with her feet out in between the front door and the hinge, so kind of holding it open in a sense. She is covered in blood and he first initially tries to find a pulse and can't do so, which is when he then rushes to ring an ambulance. Rebecca actually manages to survive for a very brief period of time while she's taken to hospital. However, by the end of the day of July the 18th, 1989, Rebecca Schaeffer is pronounced dead. Clearly no one had seen Robert carry out the attack. No one was there when he'd shot her. However, he was arrested in Tucson, Arizona the following day when a number of drivers rang up the local police department claiming to have seen a man running up and down the same highway. He was running out in front of cars as though he was trying to get hit by a car, and so they picked him up for being, I don't know exactly what charge they picked him up on actually, but obviously there's a strange man running out in front of cars, he's a danger to himself and others, and so he was arrested. But then upon being arrested, almost instantly, it was like they hadn't even pressed him for any information. He kind of just straight out comes out with the fact that he is so distraught and deeply affected by the very sudden death of Rebecca Schaeffer. And this, as you can imagine, so early on, so it's the following day after Rebecca had just been shot, this strange man had just suddenly declared that he was so distraught by her death that he decides to run out on a motorway. So as you can imagine, the officers are obviously very piqued by this. They're a little bit concerned as to what relevance this has, but there isn't really much they can do at this point. Obviously, I think they just got the sense that he's a little bit strange. And around this same time, his sister in Tennessee actually hears news of Rebecca's death. She starts hearing all the details, when she died, how she died, and she starts piecing things together. So she has knowledge of the letter that he'd sent her just a few days before, the strange phone call she received just minutes before Rebecca's death. All of this combined, she knows the history of what her brother is like. She begins to realise what her brother has done, and so she decides to straight away ring the police and tell them what she knows. So these, combined with the fact that they had just arrested him in Arizona, points towards so much suspicion on Bardo. It just makes him look so suspect. And then when an image of Bardo is shown around to all of Rebecca's neighbours, They all positively ID'd him as the man who was knocking around on all their doors the day that she died, asking if that was her address. Bardo is taken to California, where he is charged with the first-degree murder of Rebecca Schaeffer. And during the trial, the prosecutor would actually turn out to be Marcia Clark, who would later become a very well-known name when she would be the prosecutor in the case against O.J. Simpson. So in this case, Marcia's team, as well as Marcia and also Bardo, all agreed that they would move forward with the trial as a bench trial, which means that Bardo's sentencing and ultimately his fate would be decided by a judge as opposed to a jury verdict. However, Bardo only agreed to this if they could promise that there would be no possibility whatsoever of him receiving the death penalty, which they agreed to. Going into it, it seemed that the trial would be initially quite straightforward, because Bardo at this point had confessed multiple times. He just said flat out, formally and informally, that he shot Rebecca Schaeffer. So it would seem that it was kind of an open shut trial, that she didn't really have her work cut out for her at this point. However, he actually decided to plea as not guilty to the murder of, or to the first-degree murder of Rebecca Schaeffer, as he had claimed that it had not been a planned attack. So despite the obvious fact that he had turned up with the gun that he used to attack her, he chose to proceed down this route. But interestingly enough, he chose not to take an insanity plea, which he most likely would have been granted considering the fact that he had a history of a mental illness. The main issue that Marcia, the prosecutor, faced was that she could easily make the argument that he was guilty, and in all likelihood he would have received a 25-year prison sentence with eligibility for a parole at the end of it. But she wanted to guarantee that this wouldn't happen. She wanted a harsher sentence, and she also wanted to prevent him from ever getting parole, which is where she had her work cut out for her, really. She had to really, really work to try and prove that there were special circumstances in this case, that he had always had the intention to travel to Rebecca's home and murder her. And so she did so by looking through all of the old clips since he was arrested. They'd filmed all of these clips of him talking to a professional psychologist. Some of them he actually reenacted the crime itself, and he was filmed, he'd seen on camera reenacting the whole thing. But what Marcia picked up on that she could use in the trial against him to prove that he had always intended on killing her was that during these reenactments he was there pretending, almost like pretending that the psychologist was Rebecca. He was speaking to her as he did on that day, but he was holding his hand behind his back, making these gestures behind his back, which ultimately meant that he had always had the gun on him throughout the entire time that he'd been speaking to her on both encounters. And she was able to use this fact as evidence that he had always intended on killing her. And as a result, in 1991, Richard Bardo was found guilty of the murder of Rebecca Schaeffer and is sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. During his prison sentence in 2007, another inmate actually stabbed him a total of 11 times, which he somehow managed to pull through. He completely survived this attack, and he is still in prison to this day. Rebecca's story is an extremely heartbreaking one. Obviously, she was so young, she was living by herself, she did nothing wrong whatsoever. It's just an awful situation that there was not a lot to protect her, but it did force a lot of changes, so some good did come from Rebecca's case. As I said earlier in the video, there were virtually no laws to protect anyone against stalking. There were no anti-stalking rules, there was no personal security, anything. There was nothing that could have prevented people at that time from situations like this, and so her case triggered a lot of huge changes that are still used to this day. In the same year as Rebecca's death, the LAPD actually created something called the Threat Management Unit, who focused on stalking incidents specifically, which was the first in the US, first of its kind to address just stalking incidents and stalking crimes, but it gradually became a wider focus. It became more of an accepted thing that they needed to focus on personal security and safety. And then in 1991, the first anti-stalking law was passed, followed by an updated version of it in 1994, and then this led to the creation of something called the California Penal Code Section 646.9, which states that law enforcement, any authority relating to law enforcement, is able to intervene in a stalking case if they see fit. But this was just the beginning, as since then so many different security and anti-stalking laws have been implemented that there's a lot more than there ever had been. So across the country and pretty much worldwide, things like anti-stalking laws are pretty much seen as essential now. They are implemented in so many ways to prevent cases like this from ever happening again. So that is everything I'm going to discuss today. Obviously, like I've said, Rebecca Schaeffer's case is awful. The poor young girl was so talented, she was so driven, and she had fought for so much that she'd earned everything that she'd done in her life. But then this one selfish person just took away her life while she was still in her prime. It's awful, but like I said, so much good has come from her case, and this is definitely one that has stuck with me because of how much of an impact it's had on the world since then. So that is everything I'm going to talk about today. I hope you guys found this interesting. Let me know your thoughts down below, as I know this is definitely going to be a little bit different to the types of videos I've made before because of the length of it. It's definitely a lot more chatty, so let me know if you like this sort of thing and if you want me to take them down this route from now on, because I would be happy to do that. I apologise about my voice and everything. Obviously I'm still recovering from being ill and everything, but I hope you guys still found this interesting. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching.